The Amazon night was supposed to be silent, an endless black horizon stretching over the Yanomami territory until an unidentified aircraft broke through Brazilian airspace without a flight plan, without radio contact, and without the slightest intention of turning back. The question echoed across command centers: what kind of pilot risks crossing one of the most heavily monitored sections of the Amazon? That silence became the first warning, and silence in a region dominated by clandestine runways and cartel routes often signals something far more dangerous than noise. Radar operators watched the blip drift steadily southward. The aircraft, a Cessna 182 with adulterated markings, behaved like thousands of traffickers had before it low-altitude minimal transponder signature predictable vectors toward illegal mining sites. But this time, the violation occurred during heightened tension along Brazil's northern frontier, where Venezuelan economic collapse had spilled across borders in the form of smuggling networks, paramilitary groups, and corrupt intermediaries. Operators elevated the classification. The air defense protocol shifted to immediate intercept. Two A-29 Super Tucano fighters roared off their alert strip into the humid darkness, carrying both weapons and orders calibrated for a potential confrontation. Closing in, the Brazilian pilots illuminated the intruder with signal lights and radio calls. The Cessna offered no reply. It attempted no maneuver to show compliance. Instead, it pressed deeper into sovereign territory as if daring a response. That defiance forced the next procedural step: warning shots, bright streaks cutting through the night, unmistakable in their meaning. Still, the Cessna refused to yield. In that moment, the aircraft was no longer merely suspicious. It met the legal threshold for hostile classification. Few nations apply such rules more cautiously than Brazil, yet the jungle below had become a highway for narco-trafficking aircraft linked to Venezuelan networks. Restraint had limits. The Cessna finally descended in a sharp, irregular dive toward a clandestine airstrip carved out near Surucucu, a region notorious for illegal gold operations sustained by criminal groups that operate with impunity across the Venezuela-Brazil corridor. When ground forces arrived by helicopter, the aircraft sat abandoned pilot, gone instruments, dead cargo removed or never present. Only the smell of fuel and the quiet hum of insects remained. The jungle does not reveal its secrets easily, and the pilot's disappearance reinforced a troubling pattern. Whenever Brazilian authorities intercept illicit aircraft, the operators vanish into territory controlled by traffickers, mercenaries, or militants who thrive in the lawless vacuum between states. What appeared at first glance to be a simple border incident quickly escalated into a mirror reflecting the wider instability of northern South America. The intrusion violated sovereignty, but it also underscored something deeper: a battle between state authority and shadow economies that feed on collapsed political systems. While the Lula administration maintained a neutral, almost conciliatory stance toward Nicolás Maduro, Brazil's armed forces faced threats emanating from a regime that had effectively merged governance with illicit enterprise. The intercept demonstrated that even diplomacy cannot mask the reality on the ground. Criminal networks tied to the Venezuelan state are expanding, and Brazil stands on the front line whether it wants to or not. The Cessna's unauthorized flight raised a chilling question. If a single aircraft can slip into Brazil under the cover of darkness, what larger movements go undetected and what dangers wait behind them? Dawn exposed what the night had concealed: a silent aircraft resting on a dirt strip deep in the Yanomami territory, its pilot gone without leaving so much as a footprint toward any known trail. That disappearance was not an escape, it was a message. Along the Venezuela-Brazil border, people do not simply flee into the jungle unless they belong to something larger, something organized, something capable of exfiltration. The Amazon swallows the unprepared, but it protects those who already know its criminal pathways. Brazilian forces arriving moments too late confronted a familiar scene: a plane stripped of cargo serial codes, altered, and a pilot absorbed into the forest as if pulled by invisible hands. The region of Surucucu where the Cessna was forced down is more than a remote outpost. It is an artery of illegal operations, gold mining syndicates, Venezuelan traffickers, dissident armed groups, and intermediaries linked to the collapsed Venezuelan economy. Hundreds of clandestine runways operate in this shadow system, some carved by miners, others by narco-trafficking organizations that have expanded their roots as the Maduro regime grows more financially desperate. Brazilian intelligence has long warned that what happens in these borderlands lands rarely stays there. Each aircraft that crosses from Venezuela carries not only contraband, but the weight of a failing state exporting instability. Investigators who examined the abandoned Cessna noted that its registration was tampered with beyond recognition. This practice is a signature of Venezuelan criminal aviation networks, which recycle airframes, fabricate documents, and shift identities between aircraft to confuse radar logs and legal jurisdictions. Brazilian authorities neutralized and destroyed the aircraft on-site standard protocol for hostile incursions, yet the act felt symbolic. If the plane was disposable, so too was the pilot. This is the logic of a system where human life holds little value against the profits extracted from gold, cocaine, weapons, and fuel smuggling routes. Brazil's military response, rapid, precise, and fully within legal parameters, contrasts sharply with the political dissonance emerging in Brasilia. While Lula's administration avoids confrontation with Nicolás Maduro and insists on maintaining diplomatic warmth, the armed forces monitor daily incursions linked to Venezuelan networks. That discrepancy creates friction. Diplomacy suggests partnership, the battlefield suggests infiltration, and in the Amazon perception matters. Criminal groups thrive wherever the state hesitates, and every incursion unchallenged becomes an invitation for the next. For the Yanomami people, the stakes are even higher. Their territory has become a battlefield where outsiders strip rivers of gold-poisoned water with mercury and carve illegal airstrips used by traffickers and mercenaries. The mysterious pilot who vanished into the trees represents not only a criminal act, but the expansion of a system eroding indigenous lands under the weight of foreign criminal interests. Even as Brazil tries to reclaim control of the region, illicit networks adapt faster than law enforcement can dismantle them. The unanswered question remains, how many more aircraft pilots and clandestine operations cross the border unseen, feeding a machine that grows stronger each time the jungle hides its operators? The Cessna's pilot vanished, but the threat he represents has not. Just hours after the border incursion rattled Brazilian authorities, another crisis ignited, this time across the frontier in Venezuela. A fireball rose above the Petrocedeño refinery in Anzoátegui, its column of thick black smoke twisting into the sky like a warning to the entire region. Workers fled as alarms wailed, emergency crews scrambled, and officials rushed to claim that the situation was under control. But nothing about Venezuela's energy sector has been under control for years. The explosion was not an isolated failure, but part of a systemic collapse born from corruption, mismanagement, and the deliberate hollowing out of a once world-class oil industry. Footage circulating online showed molten metal dripping from skeletal towers, pipelines buckling from heat, and flames engulfing the heart of a facility that should have been one of the nation's most valuable assets. For decades, Venezuela relied on its oil might to fund social programs, military expansion, and political patronage. Now, under Nicolás Maduro's rule, its refineries resemble industrial graveyards, poorly maintained, understaffed, and stripped of expertise after countless engineers and technicians fled the country. The Petrocedeño Inferno revealed what many analysts already knew: Venezuela's energy infrastructure has decayed to a point where catastrophe is not a possibility, it is an expectation. Local authorities feared toxic fumes drifting toward nearby communities, raising the specter of ecological disaster atop economic ruin. The explosion underscored a grim irony. Venezuela, a nation with one of the world's largest oil reserves, can barely keep its refineries operational. Each fire and each collapse deepens the suffering of civilians who already endure shortages of food, medicine, electricity, and clean water. The blaze at Petrocedeño was not just a technical failure, it was a portrait of a government that allowed its most valuable industry to burn both literally and figuratively. The timing was impossible to ignore, as Brazilian fighter jets confronted a Venezuelan-linked aircraft penetrating their airspace. One of Venezuela's core economic arteries imploded in real time. Two events connected by a shared context, a regime under strain, criminal networks filling the power vacuum, and the encroaching collapse of a state seeking to mask weakness with political bravado. The Cessna's illicit mission and the refinery's failure were both symptoms of a nation spiraling deeper into dysfunction. For regional security analysts, the explosion carried deeper implications. A crippled Venezuela is unpredictable. A regime losing control of its infrastructure tends to tighten its grip on power, accelerating repression at home and destabilizing actions abroad. The spread of illegal mining and smuggling across the Brazilian border mirrors the decay of Venezuelan state capacity. As the economy shrinks, criminal factions expand, refineries burn, border incursions rise. The jungle becomes a theater of survival for traffickers and dissidents alike. Meanwhile, global powers watch closely. The United States, China, and regional partners considered the strategic consequences of a petrostate collapsing in slow motion. A refinery explosion may appear local, but the instability it represents has international reach, from fluctuations in global oil markets to migration surges and security threats migrating southward. In the end, the flames at Petrosedano symbolized a question that echoed far beyond Venezuela. When a nation's lifeline burns, what stops its crisis from spreading across every border it touches? As smoke continued to rise from the shattered Venezuelan refinery, another revelation surfaced, one that shook diplomatic circles in Washington and redefined the balance of power in the hemisphere. Leaked reports indicated that Nicolás Maduro had secretly offered to step down within 2 years, proposing a negotiated transition in exchange for sanctions relief and expanded U.S. access to Venezuelan oil markets. But the response from Washington under President Donald Trump was immediate and unequivocal rejection. For the United States, Maduro's overture was not a peace offering, but a survival tactic from a regime cornered by economic collapse and criminal entanglements. American intelligence agencies had long viewed Maduro's government as inseparable from narco-trafficking networks, paramilitary groups, and corrupt state enterprises that blurred the line between political leadership and organized crime. Any promise of transition was in their eyes an illusion, another maneuver designed to prolong a dictatorship that had already dismantled democratic institutions. High-ranking officials warned that without decisive pressure, Venezuela risked becoming a fully entrenched narco-state on the doorstep of the Americas. Trump's administration hardened its position: no staged transitions, no delayed resignations, no protection agreements. Only a full restoration of democracy, unrestricted and immediate, would satisfy Washington. That posture sharply contrasted with Brazil's political climate. While Brazilian forces confronted Venezuelan-linked incursions in the Amazon, the Lula administration maintained an ambiguous, almost gentle diplomatic stance toward Maduro, refusing to label his regime a dictatorship and avoiding measures that might strain ideological affinities. The contradiction was visible. Soldiers on the ground faced threats emanating from Venezuelan criminal networks, while politicians in Brasilia spoke the language of cooperation and non-confrontation. This divergence highlighted the growing gap between regional security realities and political rhetoric. Inside Washington, however, patience had run out. Officials debated escalating sanctions, expanding intelligence operations, and even preparing contingencies for direct action should Venezuela descend into greater instability. Analysts pointed to the recent refinery explosion as evidence of accelerating decline. A government unable to maintain its critical infrastructure, control its borders, or guarantee basic services was one misstep away from humanitarian catastrophe. And in geopolitical terms, a collapsing state becomes a vacuum that hostile actors, foreign powers, or criminal syndicates quickly exploit. The United States also weighed broader global parallels. In Eastern Europe, Ukraine fought to repel Russian aggression. In the Middle East, Israel and Iran maneuvered through shadow conflicts that risked igniting the region. In Asia, US-China tensions sharpened over trade technology and maritime dominance. Venezuela became yet another flashpoint where strategic deterrence, global competition, and ideological confrontation intersected. A soft approach risked emboldening authoritarian regimes elsewhere. A firm stance signaled that the principles of democratic governance still held weight in international diplomacy. As diplomatic cables circulated and intelligence briefings intensified, one unsettling question emerged. If Maduro's regime is willing to bargain for survival today, what might it be willing to sacrifice tomorrow? Washington feared the answer. Every delay, every negotiation, every concession risked strengthening criminal networks and weakening democratic institutions further. For a region already strained by migration instability and illicit trade, the cost of miscalculation could reverberate for years. In the shadow of these geopolitical tensions, the border incursion near Surucucu no longer appeared isolated. It was a symptom of a failing regime projecting disorder beyond its borders. And as Brazil, the United States, and neighboring states responded, the hemisphere braced for what might come next. While international attention focused on Venezuela's implosion and Washington's tightening grip, a different kind of collapse was unfolding inside Brazil, one not triggered by foreign regimes, but by the corrosion of domestic institutions. The fall of Banco Master sent shockwaves through the financial sector, revealing a labyrinth of fraudulent operations, political patronage, and systemic abuses that paralleled the dysfunction gripping Venezuela. The numbers alone were staggering: an estimated $17 billion in potential losses, fraudulent credit operations, corporations manipulated assets, and an intricate network of shell companies engineered to deceive regulators and drain public funds. Daniel Vorcaro, one of the bank's controlling partners, did not wait for accountability. He boarded his private jet in an attempt to escape the country, a decision that ended abruptly when federal agents intercepted him mid-flight. His arrest exposed not just a financial crime, but a criminal architecture operating with boldness and impunity. Court documents described a highly structured criminal organization, sophisticated in its methods and entrenched within the Brazilian financial ecosystem. The Justice Federal denied his request for release, citing the risk of continued illicit activity. It was a rare moment where Brazilian institutions pushed back against elite impunity, and yet it raised deeper questions about how such a scheme could flourish for so long. The scandal widened when investigators traced connections to public pension funds, institutions responsible for safeguarding the retirement savings of civil servants. In Amapá, the state pension fund Amprev had poured roughly $100 million into Banco Master's risky assets, ignoring repeated warnings. Its president, Yosildo Lemos, was appointed through political sponsorship by Senator Davi Alcolumbre and proceeded to make investment decisions against internal objections, regulatory alerts, and common sense. As the bank collapsed, the pensions of thousands of workers hung in the balance, exposed to reckless speculation carried out under a veil of political shielding. Further investigation revealed an even more alarming fact: Amprev's exposure was only part of a wider pattern. Across Brazil, public pension funds had been nudged directly or indirectly toward Banco Master's toxic instruments. Rio Previdencia held nearly R$1 billion in similar assets, now at risk of default. What emerged was a tapestry of political influence, negligence, and opportunism. Individuals placed in key positions not for expertise but for loyalty had gambled with public money, using pensioners' savings as collateral for opaque financial engineering. The parallels to Venezuela's economic decay became impossible to ignore. In both nations, powerful actors enriched themselves while ordinary citizens bore the consequences. The difference was scale, but the mechanisms felt alarmingly familiar: weakened oversight, politicized appointments, and a quiet merging of public responsibilities with private gains. Even as Brazil portrayed itself as a democratic counterweight to Maduro's authoritarian state, internal corruption proved capable of eroding trust just as quickly as external threats. The Banco Master collapse forced Brazil to confront an uncomfortable reality. Structural corruption does not merely strain institutions, it fractures national resilience. A country distracted by internal scandals becomes less capable of securing its borders, protecting its people, or projecting stability abroad. And as geopolitical tensions rise across the hemisphere, the weakness of one institution can ripple outward, undermining national strategy and empowering criminal networks already probing the country's vulnerabilities. Thus emerged the central dilemma: how can a nation defend itself against foreign threats when its own foundations are quietly being hollowed from within? The unraveling of Brazil's institutional fabric did not end with financial fraud or collapsed pension funds. A deeper wound soon emerged, one that struck at the very core of public trust. The INSS deduction scandal, uncovered through the Operation Sem Desconto, revealed a coordinated scheme in which millions of reais were siphoned from some of Brazil's most vulnerable citizens' retirees. Unauthorized monthly charges were extracted through partnerships between unions, associations, and complicit public officials. Yet the scandal became even more explosive when investigators discovered that among the entities benefiting from the illegal deductions was the union led by Frei Chico, brother of President Lula. Months before the scandal became public, the Advocacia Geral da União AGU had already produced an internal report detailing irregularities across 9 organizations, including those tied to Frei Chico and other influential political groups. The report recommended immediate suspension of partnerships and stronger oversight, signaling the urgency of intervention. But instead of acting, Jorge Messias, the AGU chief and longtime ally of Lula, chose a path of selective inaction. Despite having clear evidence of wrongdoing, Messias refrained from cracking down on the most politically sensitive entities. Only after the scandal exploded in the media did the government initiate public measures, but even then his official petition to the courts conveniently excluded 6 of the 9 entities flagged in the original report. Among the omitted were those closely aligned with government allies. This omission was not interpreted as a bureaucratic oversight, but as deliberate shielding, an attempt to protect political networks at the expense of the very retirees the government claimed to defend. For many Brazilians, Brazilians, the scandal evoked a familiar narrative: corruption, exposed responsibility, evaded justice, delayed, and the damage went beyond financial loss. When citizens no longer trust the institutions responsible for protecting them, societal cohesion fractures. When government allies appear immune to scrutiny, the rule of law erodes. And when those in power seem willing to protect their networks above the population, democracy itself feels fragile. The timing of the scandal sharpened its impact, as Brazil confronted illegal aircraft incursions from Venezuela border crime and escalating geopolitical tensions. Its own institutions were failing internally. Corruption was no longer an abstract concern. It was a national security issue. Every pension fund compromised, every agency infiltrated, every oversight mechanism weakened, created openings for criminal networks and for foreign adversaries watching carefully for vulnerabilities. Global comparisons drew themselves. In Ukraine, corruption crackdowns were essential to strengthening defenses against Russia. In Israel and Iran, intelligence failures carried deadly consequences. In the evolving US-China rivalry, institutional robustness defined global influence. Brazil now faced a similar crossroads. The strength of its democracy and its ability to respond to external threats depended on confronting internal decay with transparency and force. But the most unsettling question lingered. If a government is willing to ignore warnings about fraud against pensioners, what else might it be willing to overlook? And how far can public trust be stretched before it breaks entirely? The scandal left Brazil standing before an uncomfortable truth: external threats test borders, but internal corruption tests a nation's soul, and the latter, if left unchecked, can be far more devastating. The crisis began with a silent intrusion over the Amazon, a Venezuelan aircraft violating Brazilian airspace and vanishing into the jungle after a forced landing. This single event exposed the expanding power of transnational criminal networks operating between Venezuela and Brazil, networks strengthened by the collapse of state institutions under Nicolas Maduro. Hours later, an explosion at Venezuela's Petrocadeno refinery symbolized the nation's accelerating economic and infrastructural collapse, intensifying fears of regional instability. As Washington rejected Maduro's secret offer to negotiate a delayed exit from power, President Donald Trump reinforced a hardline approach aimed at preventing Venezuela from solidifying into a narco state. Inside Brazil, however, the turmoil was mirrored by domestic failures. The collapse of Banco Master revealed vast financial fraud intertwined with political patronage, threatening pension funds and eroding confidence in the nation's economic oversight. The INSS deduction scandal deepened the crisis, exposing systemic corruption and the shielding of politically connected entities. Across these events, a pattern emerged: weakened institutions, expanding criminal influence, and the growing tension between geopolitical threats and internal vulnerabilities. Together, they pose a stark question: can Brazil safeguard its sovereignty if its own institutions, financial, legal, and political, are compromised from within?